Hi, I'm Laura, and this is Tropetrinitytrilogy, and today I am here to make a plea with you, and that is to stop having your characters play games like 20 questions to get to know each other, specifically in this case, when it comes to them falling in love. So I've noticed a trend in books, and that is that when the protagonist meets their love interest and they start to get to know each other, they end up playing games like 20 questions or just sitting there asking each other about each other, or maybe doing a game where it's like you ask a question, then I ask a question, you have to tell the truth. And I read it before in high school and it was fine, but now I'm noticing a trend for one thing. And another thing, I think it's one of the least interesting ways for characters to get to know each other. I feel it borders on lazy. And even when it's done, and it can be done well, I'm not saying you can never do it, but it borders on lazy and it ties into the story the least because I specifically tend to read books that are not romance genre. They are books with romantic subplots. So, genre romance, I don't know if this would be more well perceived, but when you're reading a book that's meant to be a fantasy or a sci-fi or a dystopian and it stops the story for a whole chapter just to have the protagonist and their love interest ask each other questions, it's not my favorite. Characters, when they're getting to know each other, ideally you want them to grow closer and you want them to earn this information. When your protagonist learns their love interest's tragic backstory, you want it to be something that feels natural, not something where they both make an I'll answer any question you ask. If you answer any question I ask. Deal. It feels arbitrary. It doesn't feel like the trust is earned. It feels like because of the scenario they set up for themselves, they are agreeing to in a more contractual way. So personally, I like romances in books to feel natural. I like them to slowly grow over time, assuming that, they're not already a couple, which is fine, but I'm specifically talking about characters getting to know each other and fall in love. And so when you have characters just arbitrarily decide, I'm going to ask you questions, one, it stops the rest of the story because, again, I'm saying this is specifically for fantasy, sci-fi, not genre romance, where there's other plots besides the romance. And two, it feels less organic and it feels less earned. That's pretty much my point. And to elaborate on it, though, I have some books that do the 20 question thing that I do not like how they did it. And then I have some books where the romance, I like how it's done. And I'm going to go through these and elaborate on what I think makes it good or bad. So first, for the negative example, I have a Lightlark by Alex Astor. So just so you know, just because I'm using a book as a negative example doesn't mean I dislike the book or that I'm saying the book overall is bad. To set up the scene, this is chapter 35, The Cave. And Isla has been teamed up with the King Oro, the king of the island, and the ruler of the island, Oro, and she's the ruler of the wildlings, and they have not been getting along. Despite being a team, they constantly disagree, are bickering, and it doesn't seem to be for any specific reason besides she just dislikes him and he just dislikes her. And so they have not shown trust to each other. He especially has not revealed much of anything about himself to her, and now he's trapped in a cave until the sun sets because if he touches sunlight, he'll burn to death. And he also got injured, which is why they ended up there in the first place. So she dragged him in there. They're stuck in a cave together, and this is what happens after she agrees to wait with him. She shot a look at the light at the mouth of the cave, a carpet of gold across the floor. Seems like we'll be here a while longer, she said. Let's play a game. A game, he said flatly. Isla nodded, undeterred. Questions, back and forth. I'll answer one, and then you will. Honestly. She expected he might say her proposed game was foolish, or might even decide to brave the fiery sunlight rather than spend another moment stuck with her. But he leaned the back of his head against the wall and looked at her, chin lifted. Fine, wildling, you start. She sat up, Her important question barreled through her mind, but she couldn't ask it. Not yet. She had to start small. Be honest. Do you ever tire of wearing gold? Oro gave her a look that said, That's what you want to ask me? He sighed. Yes, wildling, though I can wear blue, white, or silver if I choose. Right. He was an origin. He could wear colors from all the realms he had powers from. She wondered if he did wear the other shades outside the centennial. Your turn. He studied her for a few moments. What is your life like back in the wildling new land? It wasn't the question she might have expected, but it was an easy one, so she was grateful. She opened her mouth. She had an answer queued up, ready to go, about how wonderful and exciting it was. But she had promised to be honest. Isla wanted him to trust her so they could find the heart and break her and Celeste's curses, which might mean trusting him in turn. It's awful. She studied the ground, running her fingers along its rough patches. I love my guardians. They're my only family. She took a long breath, but she squinted, not knowing how to say it. She met his gaze and found him watching her intently. Have you ever felt like a bird in a cage? She expected him to sneer at her, but he nodded, just a slight dip of his raised chin. Every day for the last 500 years. Of course, her limited existence locked away in her wildland castle was nothing compared to the centuries Oro had endured. Who trapped you? He asked, though it wasn't his turn. Isla winced, then cursed herself for even suggesting the game. Why would someone with so many secrets do such a thing? He had no idea how close his question was to the truth, to unraveling all the lies she'd built up like a fortress around her and her realm. Not trapped, just protected. Oro didn't push the subject, and she was glad. She hurried to ask a question of her own. Have you ever been in love? His answer was immediate. No. Why not? And blah, 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 blah. You get the point. So, the reason why I don't care for this, and the thing is, it's not inherently bad. Rereading the scene, I'm actually like, it makes sense. The character suggests it because she wants to ask him a specific question, and it'll be less suspicious if it's in a cluster of questions in like the middle, as opposed to it being just randomly asked. So she's trying to get information from him, but then she also has the moment where she's like, I need him to trust me. Maybe I should trust him in turn. And she finally is honest to him because she promised to be honest. And conceptually, it makes sense. But part of the issue with this is it also causes the scene to be very flat. So while this is definitely not the worst example of this element being done, the scene's not particularly engaging. The story has stopped and they're just going back and forth asking questions. And this is how she's getting to know him, which has some missed opportunities for a more dynamic conversation. Characters can get to know, you can get to know people without listing out questions, being like, I ask you a question, you ask me one. That's not generally how people get to know each other. Like, people will play games sometimes, but it's not the most common. And I feel this is supposed to make the protagonist seem clever for suggesting it, to find the secrets of the other character, and they happen to get to know each other and find things they relate to, which is fine, but it doesn't make the character feel clever. It feels juvenile, because that is the type of thing that makes sense for teenagers and kids, and is just a way someone might want to get to know someone, not generally commonly, but it doesn't make the protagonist seem cunning or conniving, which you think it's meant to make her seem cunning. And then with the parts where she's like, have you ever felt like a bird in a cage? And she realizes they relate, and she finally is willing to open up to him. She's not opening up because she's like, I want to trust him. She does think that, but it's more so because she agreed to be honest. And she's like, well, it's the terms of the game, and maybe if I trust him, he'll trust me. But it would have felt more meaningful if in a moment of true vulnerability for her, she decided to trust him and maybe even just asked, have you ever felt like a bird in a cage? Maybe he just saved her life and she's tired of feeling like everyone's her enemy and that she can't trust anyone. And in a moment of vulnerability, she's looking out in the birds in the sky and she says something like, I wish I could be free like them or something. And he's like, what do you mean? And she's like, have you ever felt like a bird in a cage? And he's like, every day for the last 500 years. And it would have felt more organic. Again, I think a lot of it has to do with the organicness, and also because in this specific example, while it's not like the worst example, it is kind of weird in that the protagonist is supposed to come across as cunning, and instead it comes across as immature. I would say that's the biggest issue with the scene. And also that the characters had opportunities to get to know each other well up to this point, and the fact that playing a game where they just ask each other questions is the first way they actually start to open up, it feels like it could have been done in a way that, at least for me personally, this doesn't make me think, oh, they're starting to trust each other. It's like, oh, yeah, of course, the 20 question game. Of course, the question game is being brought up because they can't actually learn to trust each other through actions. And then the other issue with it is it stops the story, and this becomes the entire scene. There's many opportunities for characters to get to know each other while doing other things. This is a fantasy book where there's this whole mystery to solve, and there's no reason why the only way these characters can get to know each other is while sitting in a cave and doing absolutely nothing else. Characters can get to know each other while pursuing their other goals, and I find that also, like, this book's not short. It's not crazy long in my opinion, but it's over 400 pages. It's like 409 pages, I think, when I just flipped through. And you can have multiple plot lines going at once. You can have them doing something in the forest while getting to know each other. And that's another example. They've been looking for the heart of Lightlark this whole time. They've been doing plant surveys, essentially, going through looking at plants. And those scenes are summarized, and they're essentially in different locations while doing it, not interacting, not talking. And there's no reason they can't be talking while searching for the heart. But instead, the searching scenes are being completely separated from the talking scenes, which is unnecessary. And so that is another issue. And so this scene is Oro gets hurt, they're stuck in a cave, and they start talking. And injuries and vulnerability tends to be a reason why characters open up and get to know each other. So in this one, though, it's not that she's tending to him, it's not that she's caring for him, she's just waiting with him, and they're asking questions. So for an example of another scene where, I'll put that in the background, where a character gets hurt and that's when they start opening up, I'm going to use Grave Mercy by Robin Lefevers as an example. I really enjoyed this book. I haven't read it since I was in high school. I need to reread it. But this book was the first romantic plot line where I was genuinely invested in them getting together. Because I tend to either actively dislike romances or not care for the romance, but like the characters separately, so I want them to get together. But this book, I genuinely was rooting for their romance. Like, I cared about them individually, but I really was invested in how they fell in love. I haven't read since high school, but I did find one of the scenes where Ismay gets injured, and this is how they start to open up in this injury scene compared to Lightlark's injury scene. So the scene just happened where Ismay got injured on her back, and the character Duval is taking her to his chambers to help care for her wounds because she's a secret assassin who's pretending that she's with him to protect the Baron or Duchess or something. I haven't read it in a while, so I don't remember exactly. But she's going back with his room, and he's insisting on helping her with her injury. Duval is quiet as he escorts me through the palace to his rooms in the North Tower. When we reach them, he leads me through a jumble of trunk and furnishings in the outer rooms to his bedchamber, where a valet is unpacking his clothes. Duval briskly waves the man away, and I blush when I realize what the servant will think. Duval sits me on the bed and angles me so that my back is to him. I am not a doll, my lord. If you but tell me what you wish to do, I can do it myself. His only response is a grunt, then the mattress dips as he sits down behind me. His body is so close, I can feel the heat rising off it. chilled by the wet blood on my gown. It is all I can do to keep myself from leaning into that warmth. He removes the borrowed cloak from my shoulders, and I hiss as the cold air sets the cut stinging. He is silent for so long I nearly squirm, except I worry the movement will bring me more discomfort. When I feel his fingers on my neck, I pull away before I can stop myself. What are you doing? My voice sounds unnaturally high to my ears. Removing the ruined bodice so I can tend to your cut. No, my lord. I jump up from the bed and spin around, putting my back safely out of his reach. Panic flutters in my breast. He cannot see it. He mustn't see me. Duval looks at me as if I am mad. Would you rather I send for a physician? No, I say, beginning to feel trapped. I have no love for the court physicians, and they will ask questions I do not wish to answer, but I cannot bear for Duval to see my ruined back. If you leave, I can tend it myself. He snorts in disbelief. Is that yet another miracle of Mortain, that his accolades are able to contort themselves enough to tend to their own backs? His voice turns gently chiding. If you are worried about the gown, I am sure the Reverend Mother will understand. But of course it is not the gown that worries me. The sense of panic in my chest grows until I can hardly breathe. Every taunt thrown at me by the village boys, every slur cast my way, every insult echoes in my head. And those were all from the villagers and peasants, people much accustomed to ugliness and deformity. Duval is of noble blood, was raised amid the beauty and finery of courts. I cannot bear that I will be the ugliest thing he has ever seen. No, I take a step backwards, determined to stay out of his reach. I do not need your help. He frowns at my unreasonableness. If we do not tend to your injury, you could well lose the use of your shoulder and arm. And how would that serve your god or your duchess? I hiss in frustration. Trust Duval to find the one argument that will remind me of my true purpose here, my only purpose here. My service to Mortain comes before all else. There is no place for modesty or shame. Perhaps the god is testing me even now to see if my vanity is stronger than my duty to him. Feeling raw and exposed, I cannot help but grumble. What would a man know of stitching anyway? Duval laughs outright at that, and a small hidden dimple winks briefly at the corner of his mouth. If a man expects to survive in battle or help his fellow men-at-arms afterward, he will indeed learn to stitch, and to stitch well, if not prettily. Now quit putting this off. Slowly I return to the bed, sit down, and turn my back to him. And I feel hollow inside, and remind myself that what Duval thinks of me or my scar is of no importance. Indeed, perhaps his disgust and revulsion will help rebuild the barrier that once stood between us. The words he spoke when he left the convent echo through me. Being sired by one of the old saints puts your lineage into a class all its own, a class as untouchable by the nobility as the nobility is by the turnip farmers. He may claim such lofty ideals, but it is another thing altogether to see with one's own eyes what marks such a parentage leaves behind. I hold myself rigid as he unlaces my bodice. It starts to fall forward and I catch it with my hands, hugging it to me like a shield. There is a rustle movement as he takes the dagger from his belt. The tearing sound as he cuts away my ruined chemise is loud in the quiet room, and the rush of air against my damp back makes me shiver. I clutch the front of my gown tightly and steel myself against what must surely happen next. The silence grows impossibly long, and I am painfully reminded of the hideous silence when Giolo saw my back, of his fear and anger and revulsion. I force myself to breathe. Ah, Duval says, so this is what you didn't want me to see? Poor Ismay. His voice is as soft and tender as a caress. I square my shoulders and stare straight ahead. How did you come by it? He asks. 'Tis where the herb witch's poison burned me when my mother tried to cast me from her womb. When he touches my shoulder again, I bite back a yelp of surprise, and my skin twitches beneath his fingers. Slowly he traces my scar. It is exquisitely sensitive. The pleasure unfurls across my skin, so intense and unexpected that it feels as if I have been brushed by an angel's wing. It is all I can do to keep from leaping from the bed and bolting. Perhaps sensing this, Duval speaks, his voice low. There's no shame in scars, Ismay. I long to laugh at his gentle words, to throw them back in his face and claim I do not care what he thinks. But I do care. far more than I have any right to, and his acceptance undermines every last defense I possess. So anyway, the point of this is, well, in both Lightlark and Grave Mercy, a character gets injured, so they're together and they end up revealing things about themselves. In this one, he's injured. She's not really caring for him at this point, and they're just sitting waiting for sunlight, and she decides to ask him questions. And yes, him being trapped is relevant, but I much prefer how this book does it, where she is injured and he must help care for her wound so it doesn't get infected. And this really focuses on one of her greatest insecurities, and that is a giant scar on her back. And you can see how she is resisting, how there's conflict between them and they're going back and forth. And when he mentions her loyalty to the god, how she has to complete the mission, that's what gets her to finally agree to what he's doing. It's not necessarily because of him personally, it's because she's like, you're right, duty over my personal insecurities, so I will let you help me. And then when the scar is revealed, he shows sympathy and empathy towards her instead of insulting her or being disgusted. And he not only does that, he touches it. And this acceptance, as it says in the story, completely destroys the barrier. The wall between them breaks down, and she's like, he's accepted me. And even though she's been pretending this whole time she doesn't care what he thinks, she doesn't care about him, she just cares about duty, this acceptance makes her realize, no, I do care. And it does mean a lot to me that he's accepted me when so many people have rejected me and scorned me for this scar. And then on top of that, she does end up asking him if he has scars, and he mentions that he does. So there is a question she asks of him later on in the scene, but the scene is more purposeful. It's about, she got injured in duty to trying to protect someone while in a fight. She got injured, and so now, I remember how she got the injury, but I'm not going to say because, spoilers. But the reason they're together is because he's healing her, not because they're waiting for the sun to rise and they have nothing to do. Like, they have a specific goal that they're physically doing, and there's conflict back and forth between the characters because of their internal struggles and beliefs. And so it feels much more organic to me, in my opinion. It feels more organic to me. And none of the questions or conversation feels arbitrary. It's not some arbitrary, what's the first question I can think of? Ask it, and you have to answer because you agreed. The vulnerability seems more natural, and in fact, in some ways, this is forced vulnerability. She doesn't want it, but she has to because of her injury, and she needs someone to help her. She'll get infected and maybe die. So the vulnerability, though, feels more organic to what's happening in the story and isn't just an arbitrary, we agreed that we'd be honest about our questions, so we're gonna be. So this, I think, is the superior version of injured and being vulnerable versus this one where it's just like, let's ask questions to pass the time because you're injured and we have nowhere else to go. So that is comparison number one. Better one, not good one. Highly recommend this book. I really liked it. I want to reread it too. So let's go into the next negative example, and that is The Pawn and the Puppet by Brandy Elise Zeker. That's her name. I'm sorry, I can't pronounce your name. I'm really bad at pronouncing things. It's like Szeker. That's above my pay grade. This book is about Skylena, who works at the Emerald Lake Asylum, and she really wants to work with the most dangerous patient there, Dessin. And Dessin has multiple personalities, and Dessin is one of his personalities. So this story has multiple times where in chapter 18, it's literally called The Secrets Game. And it's like, I have a question. Dessin's voice snatches my focus into a snare. Okay. And then they play a game where they ask each other secrets. So this is what Skylena says. Let's play a game, I say, leaning forward in my seat. He reciprocates my movement, leaning in, his chains collecting at his ankles. You have my attention? Good, because you still don't have mine, I challenge. At this, he releases a full-on grin. His teeth are pinned straight and glossy white. And dimples. You tell me a secret, and I tell you one. No questions, only answers. Destin considers this, eyes lowering in concentration. The last woman I told a secret ended up with a cracked spine in 3 different places. His stare is lethal. He knows I know who he is talking about. In fact, he pauses, adjusting his wrist under the shackles. I'm fairly certain she resides in the West Wing, also known as the Rehabilitation Ward. Humorous, don't you think, considering recovery most likely isn't in her cards. What? He stops me. No questions, only secrets. You're breaking the rules already. Oh, sweet tree sap. What? Sorry, I forgot. Apparently that's her swear word now. You're right, I say. So I guess that means it's my turn. He nods once. I have a paralyzing fear of enclosed spaces. My thoughts jump back to his CERN confession. That's why he hurt her. He told her a secret. Did he try to kill her to cover it up? I killed 6 people the day I admitted myself here. Emotionless, ice-colded words. A jolt to my entire system. I try not to act fazed by a secret, but now I know he is, in fact, a murderer. He closes his eyes, smiles to himself. I don't think there are any secrets you can tell me that would surprise me. A burning urge to prove him wrong rises under my chest. I think the only reason I can connect to patients with such ease is that I belong here too. My secret is, I don't think my mind survived the trauma of my childhood. Why am I so dramatic? Destin's body goes rigid. Skylena, he whispers, like a hollow drum laced with spider silk that clings to my ears. His lips part, and there is a thought reaching from his mouth, trying to break free. His eyes are conflicted, darting across the floor, though he is settling a silent argument. Suddenly his face is calm again, and unfaltering with confidence, he lowers his head and raises his eyebrows at me in a condescending glower. If I had a heart, that might have worked on me. Pretty much that's the end of the game. And then in another scene where he breaks out of his cell. Oh, also that scene is when she first is near the beginning of when she first goes into his cell and starts to talk to him because she's his psychologist and is trying to do psychology on him. Now, I don't think the psychology in this book is very accurate. And this is one of the first times of her trying to get him to open up. Then the second scene is he breaks out of his cell, grabs her, and kidnaps her and takes her into a basement with him, and they're just sitting in a basement for some reason. Can we at least talk while we're down here? This is her. You want to talk? He mocks. I flinch. Is that a problem for you? I took you hostage, and you want to talk. He stares at me in disbelief. Are you going to hurt me? I ask hoarsely with a slight crack in my voice. Oh, I didn't do that right. Are you going to hurt me? I ask hoarsely with a slight crack in my voice. Not unless you give me a reason to, he smiles. In that case, I say, scooting closer to him, I have a question. And yeah. Another time where the character's like, I have a question. And I said that as my catchphrase growing up. I would say I have a question, which is fine. But the characters in this book, literally it's just them talking and asking questions. And the first game was not even the only game they play. Later on in the story, almost, he says with a smile, it's time to start another game. And what are the rules to this game? For every memory of your past you tell me, I will give you a clue to my past. And so on and so forth. I'm pretty sure this whole book is just them playing question games. Like, literally every time they're talking, they do some sort of question game or secret game or memory game. And you know what? It's not that interesting. So first of all, it's ignoring the fact that it's not how psychology is meant to be. You're not supposed to be revealing your secrets to your patient, but also the character has no formal training, so it makes sense she sucks at it. But ignoring that, them getting to know each other is just question games, which, like I said, it feels extremely inorganic, and the story ends up just being characters asking each other questions over and over and over again. And so I want to give an example of characters talking to each other and getting to know each other without it being just them asking each other a bunch of questions. So for my other example, I'm going to use... Wait, no, I wasn't supposed to use Boots. I meant to grab this book, which is The Wolf and the Hawk by Julian Greystoke. So, Well, this book has two characters where the male character doesn't want to get to open up to the female character. So the way she gets him to open up is to play arbitrary question games. In this book, it has the same thing where the male character doesn't want to open up to the female character. And this is a scene where they run into each other and she's trying to get to know him still, but he's still putting up a wall. And this is how it's done in this scene. To set it up, Ryoni is the Wolf of Wern, and she is married, and she had just married at the beginning of the book Alexander, known as the Hawk of Gad. And so they got married in an arranged marriage, and she wants a genuine relationship, but he's completely shut her out. He barely talks to her, he barely sees her, and so she's in the castle by herself, and she ends up going to the library and is trying to make a map of the kingdom so that she can be a better queen, and because he's not interacting with her or helping her at all. So, begin scene. She chose the dining hall as it was a bit damp outside and she didn't want to ruin the delicate pages. She was already worried about tearing them accidentally. Under one of the tall windows with sunlight streaming in and sending little motes of dust dancing, Ryoni laid out her hall, trying to arrange her maps into a semblance of the full kingdom of Ged. There were noticeable gaps, but she did her best. She plopped down on the bench, chin in hand, pondering if she had one of the rivers in the wrong place. It didn't feel correct where it was, but if she moved it, it would mean 2 of her other books would have to be relocated, and she didn't know where she would place those either. This would be so much easier if I could read Getty, she growled in frustration. She was so busy scowling at her spread that she didn't hear him enter. Ah, Ryoni's head jerked up and she spun, ashamed. No one had told her she wasn't allowed to take the books, but she still felt caught out like a naughty child. Xander, too, had a book, though his was considerably smaller. He held it open and Ryoni gave him a questioning look. Were you reading and walking at the same time? Xander blinked and a faint smile emerged. He snapped his book shut. Perhaps. Don't you run into things? Sometimes his eyes twinkled and she cursed herself for finding them enticing. I was looking for a good place to enjoy my book with less danger of tripping. This is a good spot, Ryoni settled back on her bench. With the sun shining, it's almost pleasant in here. That was my hope, Xander agreed. A heavy curtain of tension settled over them for a moment. He didn't seem to know what to do with himself now. Finally, he noticed her book collection. His brows creased and he crossed to her, studying the spread. What is going on here? Recreating Ged. Ryoni plopped her chin into her hands, scanning the open pages. Huh, Xander's eyebrows rose. That's clever. I could have gotten you a map if you wanted one. When? She said flatly, leveling a steady gaze on him. He winced. Fair point. I have been somewhat absent. Still, this is clever. He gestured at her layout. Is this river in the right place? Xander leaned in, one of his hands resting beside her own. She could have reached out with her little finger and touched his. He smelled of moss and damp, like the mist on the moor. She tried and failed to ignore it. Xander nodded. Yes, it is in the correct spot. That's the little winding river. He touched another page. I would have never thought of arranging books into a full map. Ryoni hid her smile behind her fingers. It took a few hours, and I had to guess at some point, especially as the Vern learned landscape by landmarks in person and hold them in our minds. Though perhaps if I had a map like the one in the war room, Xander flinched appropriately at her jab. He withdrew his arm and looked ready to retreat, but after a moment seemed to change his mind. What's your map for? Practice, Ryoni shrugged. If I'm the Queen of Ged, I should know the landscape. She didn't need to add that he should have been showing her around. He twitched again at her all her blows were landing today, and it gave her a victorious thrill. Xander cleared his throat and squinted at Ryoni's books again. There's a new village there. He reached out to tap the page. Ryoni leaned to scan the open plot of moor, her hair falling onto the books. Anna had left much of it loose today, only keeping a small crown of braids around Ryoni's head. She thought she might have imagined it, but she could have sworn she heard Xander's breath catch. He hesitated, then produced a piece of writing charcoal from a pouch and passed it to her. She eyed the charcoal. I didn't think books were for writing in. Not my books, he flashed a smile that vanished as quickly. But this one's my father's, so have at it. Ryoni considered for a moment, then sketched a little village where Xander indicated. What's it called? Rainier. Ryoni frowned. What does that mean? Warrior something, I think. Warrior then. Rarity wrote the Vern word for warrior in a few decisive strokes of charcoal. Those are letters, Xander leaned in again. Of course they're letters. And they're not all curvy and timid like Getty letters either. Another quick flash of a smile rewarded her joke. You're sure your father won't mind if I write in his books? Xander stepped back and something like pain passed across his face. In all honesty, Rarity, I was hoping to find you today. This is new. She was concerned over his change of subject, but let him have it. Xander winced. I know I've been distant, and I don't really have a good explanation, but I think his pain looked hardened. I think I need your help now. I'm going to finish there. So, the point is, though, is in this book, Rarity wants to get to know Xander, and this isn't a perfect equivalent scene because this is a bit later in the book when they've known each other and he's coming to her for something, so it's a bit different than the other one. But the point is the scene starts with her trying to make a map and she helps him with it, and she comments on his culture with the letters, and then it leads into him asking her for something, and she's like, we could be a team in the first place. You don't need to ask me that. You just need to let me in. And then it ends with them being like, hey, let's go practice with swords, which is where the conversation continues. And I think this is important to point out because both scenes have the characters actively doing something. She's trying to learn the landscape of the kingdom, and he helps her with it. And that scene is very much in his element. And then with the next one, it's in her element with sword fighting. And so with that, I think this scene is better because the characters are, one, not just asking each other arbitrary questions, but two, there is a triangulation of the scene. This is something I've noticed in books for a while, and that is when the characters are just talking and there's no other things happening. However, in this scene, in the one I read to you and the preceding one, the characters are talking, but they're also talking about something different at different points. So, yes, they are talking about the map and working around the map, but there's some subtext to what they're saying that reflects their struggles. And then it eventually just becomes plain text. However, by having the characters do something else while they're interacting, it adds some complexity to the scene and allows it to feel more integrated in the story. And also, I find with this compared to the other one, it's almost as if the setting, the backdrop, everything fades away and it's just a conversation. This one keeps you more grounded in the world and the events of the story so that as they're getting to know each other, it still feels like the rest of the story's there. It doesn't feel like a timeout for the characters to get to know each other. It's the main story. And also this story is a fantasy romance. So the romance is a big thing in this. Actually, I'm surprised. I just realized this one I think is also a big part romance, and this one is also romance. So actually, some of these are romance books, but yeah, my point is this one is due to the fact that the characters are actually doing something as they get to know each other, and the conversation sparks from the activity and not them just arbitrary asking questions. I find it flows much better and is more engaging. Now, I understand this book, she's talking to someone as a psychologist, so it could not be as active as this one. But for you who, depending on what you're writing, my point is that I personally prefer when the characters are doing an activity and that sparks their conversation and how it goes. So, these books back here. Now, let's get to the third example of what I think could be improved. Now, this book is different than the other examples that are negative examples because I genuinely really like this book. And this book is Aletheia by Megan Tennant. So the reason I want to bring up this book, I actually reviewed this book and I'll link the review below. And I mentioned this in the review. This book, I really like it. It's a dystopian, it has zombies. The characters are really well thought out and have a lot of depth to them. My problem is there's some issues with the execution of this book, and the reason I want to use this as an example is because unlike The Pawn and the Puppet and Lightlark, where I don't really particularly care for the books as much, so I don't have as much constructive criticism, especially for The Pawn and the Puppet. I don't know what to do to fix it besides not that. This one, I have a specific thing that could have improved it. So, in this book, the protagonist, 736, is essentially a slave to the country Iris. She lives underneath it and is sent out every day into the apocalyptic zombie-filled world to bring stuff back. She has like wristband sensor things on her that will kill her if she tries to escape or something, so she can't just escape, but she is allowed to roam the apocalyptic world and has some privacy in that way. So when she's out there, she meets a rebel boy named Jason, who's trying to convince her to join the rebellion and work for them to defeat Iris. So he's trying to get her to learn to trust him. And so this scene, I think she has already gone to see him once, and he took her to a rooftop of an old museum, and he gave her all the things she was supposed to steal and bring back to Iris. And now they are having this scene. Jason's rooftop sanctuary is alive with the sound of rain today. The droplets create a loud and beautiful song against the tinted glass above. Streams flow in through the missing pieces of glass, and I have to force myself to turn away from the beauty and focus on Jason, although I don't find I mind staring at him instead. So, are you going to tell me about this breakout yet? I stare at him. I stare him down, imagining that my glare is tearing away his resolve to hide things, but I'm smiling today, which probably makes the glare much less effective. I can't help it though. There's something about rain that makes me feel alive. Maybe it's the way the droplets pull strange and enjoyable scents from the concrete, earth, and plants. Maybe it's the soft song of the rain against its surroundings. Maybe it's the invigorating chill that runs up my back. Whatever it might be, I love it. Jason chuckles at my newest demand for information. All in good time. Well, actually tomorrow when you go to Haven to meet Maddox. Until then, I got nothing for you. If you want, you can stay here, but on one condition. My eyebrows ask the question for me, and he pulls a notebook out of his bag, patting it with his hand. We play a game called As Many Questions as It Takes for You to Punch Me. The rules are simple. I ask you questions until you get annoyed beyond reason and make me stop. And why the hell would I answer your questions? My eyebrows pull up and curiosity tugs at me. Because otherwise, I'll kick you out, he says matter-of-factly. My eyes scan the rooftop. Droplets of water falling through broken panes of glass above spatter on the swaying leaves. The smell of plants, earth, and rain permeate my nose. It is truly beautiful up here. Fine, I'll do it, I sigh, but my shoulders are relaxed and my voice comes out easily. But also on one condition. You have to answer every question too. He says, grasping his chin. That might make the questions about what kind of panties you're wearing kind of awkward. What happens if I punch you now? I hop up on the table and sit cross-legged. He laughs in a weirdly musical way that puts me off balance. I guess it will be a short game then. Jason wasn't lying when he said questions to the point of where I would want to punch him. If I wasn't making him answer each one with me, the game would have ended quickly. It turns out I'm much better at asking questions than answering them. His notebook is marked with line after line. He says that every time he's thought of something he wanted to ask, he's written it down. And I'm still surprised he could have thought of so many things. None of his questions have to do with panties, thankfully. He ends up answering more than me, though because he has a full life of experiences, he coaxes more words out of me than I have ever spoken in a single day in my memory. I've never spent so many straight hours with someone in my memory either. It scares me how at ease I am with him, how much I'm enjoying this. I lose track of the questions, but not the information I gain. Jason's favorite color is bright green, like a new leaf. Mine is blue, like the wide open sky. He loves rain and storms and is surprised to find that I share the sentiment. His favorite animals are cats, and I confess that I like birds, and I admit the reasoning is cliche and stupid, but I envy their complete and utter freedom. His favorite food is oranges, and I wish I knew the taste of normal food so I could answer the question too. His favorite smell is rain on concrete, and I tell him that mine is the smell of plants and the fresh burst of air when I leave the compound. And it goes on and on. Like, there's some about her first memory, her first kiss, about some of her friends. And I personally find this to be a very big missed opportunity but the frustrating thing is that this book involves the protagonist being sent out into ruins to collect things. Sometimes even zombies, which the male character Jason would be against 736 doing this. And so the missed opportunity of this is, why are these characters in a safe, secluded rooftop just asking each other arbitrary questions when they could be bonding through surviving the ruins? And there's so much missed opportunity for complexity and for for complexity to these scenes of them getting to know each other and conflict of them having to survive and him helping her collect the things she needs to get together. Because with him just bringing her stuff, and then also she's not getting zombies at this point because she's like, I have so many points. If I lose points from not getting them, I'm fine. I'm not going to get in trouble. By doing that, it makes the story have less conflict than it realistically should. And also, having characters get to know each other through struggle and danger and situation is much more interesting than having them sit and talk. And while there are moments where sitting and talking is fine, having them survive together is a good way for them to get to know each other too. And I personally just think this is a good example of a missed opportunity for a triangulation of a scene. There's even a triangle in it. And so it would have been much more interesting if 736 and Jason got to know each other while doing something else, as opposed to him being like, I need to get to know you because you're supposed to trust me as a rebel. So the best way to learn to trust each other is by asking each other random questions until you know things about them, and then boom, we'll trust each other. And that's not how trust works. You don't trust someone because you know that their favorite color is green. You trust someone because they know that when you need them, they'll be there for you. They'll have your back. Or some people might trust them because they know their favorite color is green. But that's not why you should trust them. That's called bad reason to trust someone. But the point is while this story, I really enjoy this book, there's a lot of missed opportunity for these characters to bond and get to know each other while actively being part of the world and plot. And I think this is a very obvious example of a book that missed that opportunity. Now I want to give a good example of a male character trying to get to know the female character when he first meets her. Now, again, this is a bit different. This female character does have a secret, actually. So this is The Goose Girl by Shannon Hale. So this book follows Princess Anadori Calandra Taliana Isili, Crown Princess of Kildenry, and she goes by Ani. So the story essentially starts with her being sent to another kingdom, Bayern, to get married to the prince in an arranged marriage because her mom's like, you are not ruler material, your son's gonna be ruler because you talk to geese and girl, you crazy, you're stuck with people, so be gone. Go marry the guy and make an alliance. But Ani's lady maid, who is really good with talking to people in a very manipulative way, ends up convincing the men who are escorting her to try to kill her, and she ends up escaping, but the other girl is now pretending to be Ani as the princess. And so Ani goes to the kingdom of Bayern and gets hired as a goose girl and goes under the name Izzy and is hiding her hair and dyeing her eyebrows so she looks like a brunette. And she ends up running into a guard while she's being Goose Girl, and she sees him trying to break a horse, and her geese startle him or something like that. And they meet, they talk a bit, and then she leaves. And then he comes back later on to get to know her, and this is how this book involves a male character trying to get to know a female character. Also, this book is middle grade, for the record. At noon, when Conrad had crossed the hedge to the sheep boy's field on his daily wanderings, Ani heard hoofbeats. It was one man on a Doric horse, and he rode directly to her tree. Her muscles shook quietly, but she stayed still and watched the shadow of his hat move on his face until she recognized him. Goose Girl, Jared called out. She stepped out from behind the tree and leaned against its smooth gray trunk. Jared dismounted and walked the horse to her, one hand resting on the neck of his mare. I don't know your name, he said. I'm called Izzy, she said. Izzy, that suits you better than Goose Girl, doesn't it? Yes, she said. I need to use her voice. Yes, sorry that I didn't know that before, Izzy. That's all right. I didn't tell you. No, you didn't, did you? No. He said, and coughed. The conversation halted, Jarek staring at a print his boot left in the still wet ground, Ani looking off toward the geese, as though they might flee to the woods if not under her constant gaze. He cleared his throat and said the beginning of a word, then stopped and lowered his brow. Annie noticed that he had an expressive brow and eyes the color of warmed honey. She looked away from him to the horse. Not the bay, she said. At her words, he looked up gratefully. No, he said. I traded him for one a mite tamer. I thought after my embarrassing display, it was clear the beast needed to be handled by a master. Did I do well? Surely, she said, surprised he sought her approval. He was quiet again, and she waited. I came here for 2 days, he said, but you were gone, and the geese were gone, and I thought I was mistaken. It was a different pasture where we met. No, but it was raining, and then it was market day, of course. Don't you go to the market? And you came in the rain? Jarek laughed a little. I was wretched wet, and so were the flowers. He looked at her curiously, paused, then deluged her with explanations. I'm such a dunce, truly I am. And I went home that night after we spoke, and you rode the horse, and I made that terrible error, made you feel as though I thought you were of less worth than a stone. I'm sure. Well, I felt like a kingly dolt, as I should have. I hadn't a right to come here and ride around like a fool and insult you and leave without explanation, except that I've never met a Goose Girl before, and you're not what I expected. Though that's no explanation, I know. Still, I thought I'd better come back and bring you flowers, because I read that gentlemen give a lady flowers, and I thought maybe I'm not a gentleman, but no reason not to treat you like a lady. Isn't that so? He waited for her to answer. Yes, she said. It seemed the only answer to give. He nodded, relieved. Well, the rain made them a mess, the flowers, half of them bald of petals, and the stems weak as noodles, and I was beginning to think that flowers were a silly idea. That you think I don't know what, but I kept them all week, because the last couple of days I couldn't escape to come and explain, and yesterday the flowers just flat died. So when I left today, I didn't have any flowers, and I wasn't sure I'd find you anyhow. So I grabbed what I could, and it was food. He pulled a potato sack off the back of his saddle and showed the contents: apples, a loaf of potato bread, cold ham, and a leather pouch filled with custard. What you could find? This to be a feast in the workers' hall. Are you a kitchen man, then? No thanks, Bee, or I could never escape so often as I do. He gave her half a grin as he spread out their feast on the sack. I should confess something to you. Some of the palace guards bet me that I couldn't tame that bay, and if you had taken him for a time, I would have claimed credit for his taming. Annie gasped and smiled. You would not. Jarek laughed a little, bowing his head, and nodded. Yes, I probably would have. You may not know what terrible ego beatings we men give each other. So you're a guard? Yes, that's right. Now why couldn't he have been one of mine? But if he were her guard, she would be a princess, and just then she wanted to be someone who sits in a pasture with another someone and eats cold ham on potato bread. So they did. After a time, he lost the halting manner of his apology, and they talked so long and easily that Annie's throat went dry, and she wished for water. He wanted to know all about how she passed her time. When he learned that his picnic was the first noon dinner she had eaten as a Goose Girl, Jarek swore he would bring her dinner every day. If I ruled, you'd all dine, he said. Would that were you king? Jack rushed toward her, honking all the way as though he would bite her, but she honked once to stop his advance, and he turned and waddled away. What was all that? Asked Jarek, standing. Jock, my little friend, he's angry that I left him in the goose pen these past nights. He's grown used to sleeping in the crook of my knee. Well, I'll have none of that, some brazen bird speaking harsh words to his mistress. After all, I'm a gentleman. He stuck out his tongue in an ungentlemanly face and ran after Jacques. The goose soon realized he was being pursued and fled across the field, flying in short spurts and running as fast as his flat feet could propel him. Jarek slipped once on the wet grass, but quickly regained his feet and grabbed Jacques around the middle. It's time for an apology, he said, walking back to the beach with Jacques in hand. I've become an expert in apologies today, so I know, little brother, that it's time. Careful, Jarek, you might, said Annie as Jacques turned his head and bit Jarek on the arm. Jarek exclaimed and dropped the goose, who wasted no time fleeing the scene, and Annie, despite her experience with goose bruises, could not hold back a laugh. I'm sorry, my lady, said Jarek, rubbing his arm, but I failed to force an apology out of the offending goose. You're not likely to either. He's a naughty bird. They all are. Poor company. Oh, but I like my geese. Like cats, they can't be told what to do, and like dogs, they're loyal, and like people, they talk every chance they get, though they'll never deliver half so good apology as I do. No, not half so good, she said. They laughed together and lay back on the grass, their heads on his rolled cloak, chuckling intermittently, and claiming clouds to be ponies and dragons and large-bosomed women. Jarek took his leave long afternoon. He promised to return the following day if he could, hoisted himself on the mare's back, and rode away. Jarek, she called. He turned back around. What kind of flowers were they? I don't know, he said. He made a faltering gesture with his hands, forming their size and shape from the air. They were yellow and smallish and had lots of petals. Thank you, she said. They were beautiful. So I know this isn't a one-for-one example because the circumstances are a lot less intense than a dystopian world. However, I do think that this gives a good example of a guy trying to appeal to a woman and get to know her. And it's really fun. And they like go around, talk to the geese, and she's doing her job. Yes, this one is a bit slower. I was asking for an action scene with that. I can't think of an action scene right now where the characters get to know each other through it. Besides that, though, my point is that even if it's not an action example like I requested here, I'm having trouble thinking of one right now. Um, it's not necessarily that I want an action one for everything. The point is that it ties into the story better, and also instead of it being like, let's ask each other questions so we can trust each other, instead he does something in good faith. He gives her something, and they spend time talking, and there's a lot of joking and teasing, and he's making fun of himself because of his behavior before. And I think it's a good example of how characters can get to know each other and grow close without asking for facts. Like sometimes people, it's not about just knowing a list of facts about someone, it's about getting along and enjoying your time together. And I think this is a good example of that. Lastly, I would like to give an example of characters asking benign questions in a way that I thought was done well, and that would be Catching Fire by Susan Collins. So if you don't know, The Hunger Games is this series is a dystopian that takes place in the country of Panam, where children are randomly drawn from a raffle and forced to fight to the death. Peeta and Katniss are the boy and girls from their district who are drawn to fight, and they end up fighting together in the first game, and they're able to beat the capital and allow them both to live instead of only one, and they both become victors. However, they get through it by pretending to be in love, and while Peeta is actually in love, at least we think he is, Katniss actually isn't sure in the original book. In the second book, they're very cold to each other because he realized she was faking everything, and this is them going on their victory tour, and he's talking to her being like, hey, let's actually, get along, we don't have to actually be in love, but, I don't want to never talk and then just pretend we're in love, we can be friends. So this is a scene of them on the train during the tour. So Katniss is also very stressed in the scene because she just got threatened by the president. Katniss just snapped at Effie, who is the lady who, I don't know how to describe it, but essentially keeps her schedule and takes her to everywhere and is in charge of that. So Katniss just snapped at her and ran off to a different part of the train. And this is what happens. After a while, I hear footsteps behind me. And this is the scene where they do kind of do the arbitrary question thing. Now, granted, this is book 2. This isn't even book 1. They've gotten to know each other somewhat in book 1 already. After a while, I hear footsteps behind me. It'll be Haymitch coming to chew me out. It's not like I don't deserve it, but I still don't want to hear it. I'm not in the mood for a lecture. I warned the clump of weeds by my shoes. I'll try to keep it brief. Peeta takes a seat beside me. I thought you were Haymitch, I say. No, he's still working on that muffin. I watch as Peeta positions his artificial leg. Bad day, huh? It's nothing, I say. He takes a deep breath. Look, Katniss, I've been wanting to talk to you about the way I acted on the train. I mean, the last train. The one that brought us home. I knew you had something with Gale. I was jealous of him before I even officially met you. And it wasn't fair to hold you to anything that happened in the games. I'm sorry. His apology takes me by surprise. It's true that Peeta froze me out after I confessed that my love for him during the games was something of an act. But I don't hold that against him. In the arena, I'd played that romance angle for all it was worth. There had been times when I didn't honestly know how I felt about him. I still don't, really. I'm sorry too, I say. I'm not sure for what exactly. Maybe because there's a real chance I'm about to destroy him. There's nothing for you to be sorry about. You were just keeping us alive. But I don't want us to go on like this, ignoring each other in real life and falling into the snow every time there's a camera around. So I thought if I stopped being so, wounded, we could take a shot at just being friends, he says. All my friends are probably going to end up dead, but refusing PETA wouldn't keep him safe. Okay, I say. His offer does make me feel better, less duplicitous somehow. It would be nice if he'd come to me with this earlier, before I knew that President Snow had other plans and just being friends was not an option for us anymore. But either way, I'm glad we're speaking again. So what's wrong? He asked. I can't tell him. I pick out the clump of weeds. Let's start with something more basic. Isn't it strange that I know you'd risk your life to save mine? But I don't know what your favorite color is, he says. A smile creeps onto my lips. Green. What's yours? Orange, he says. Orange? Like Effie's hair? I say. A bit more muted, he says. More like sunset. Sunset. I can see it intimately. The rim of the descending sun. The sky streaked with soft shades of orange. Beautiful. I remember the tiger lily cookie, and now that PETA is talking to me again, it's all I can do not to recount the whole story about President Snow, but I know Hamish wouldn't want me to. I'd better stick to small talk. You know, everyone's always raving about your paintings. I feel bad I haven't seen them, I say. Okay, so that's enough. So the reason I feel it works in this is it's not necessarily like the author stopping the scene to be like, let's do a question game. The characters are talking and they've been through so much together. Like how I was saying, I want more action stuff. But when they're in the game together, they're putting on a facade and they risk their lives for each other, but they don't actually know each other that well. So by having him ask the colors in the way he did, it's meant to point out how, yes, they've done so much for each other, but they don't actually know each other that well. And something as simple and mundane as knowing someone's favorite color is a way to kind of emphasize that. He doesn't know the little things about her. He knows what she's willing to risk and what she's willing to die for, but he doesn't know the simple things, the nice things. And so by having that conversation, it kind of emphasizes that aspect of their relationship. And I think it's done well here. Also, instead of them wallowing on it, I like how his favorite color is orange because I feel like that's a less popular favorite color too. And the fact that it's sunset also shows how he appreciates beauty, which fits because he's a painter. And then which makes sense because they start to talk about that. And I like that too because it allows the conversation, instead of it just being question, it's one question each, and then the conversation naturally flows from there. So while I'm not a fan of the question thing all the time, I think it's done well in this with just the simple question, what's your favorite color? So these are all the books I gave examples of. Bad example, good example, bad example, good example, bad example, but I like the book. Good example, good example. And so I hope I did them justice, especially the good ones, because I'm really bad at reading out loud. But honestly, I feel like this topic is best done with actual examples of how it has been done. So, however, the point of this is there's so many ways to get characters to get to know each other and to grow closer that you don't really need to have them do arbitrary question games. Yeah, so I hope this made you think of different possibilities of how to get characters to know each other. And I also hope this allows you to realize that knowing facts about each other is not necessarily the same as truly knowing someone. And I feel like some of the issues in these stories is that people are like, I don't want them to just fall in love when they don't actually know each other. So they're like, to get them to know each other, I need them to learn all this information about each other as quickly as possible, which feels forced. So having your characters organically get to know each other without arbitrarily asking questions is something I much prefer. And I hope these examples gave you some ideas. Anyway, let me know if you liked the examples that I liked, or if you disagree and you like some of the examples I didn't like. Again, I like this book, so this isn't saying the book's bad. I did a whole review on it. I very much enjoyed this book, but this aspect was a missed opportunity in my opinion. But I also highly recommend all these books. Anyway though, that's all my thoughts on this topic. Please let me know if you agree, disagree about any of these examples or the topic in general. Do you have any examples of books where you feel like the characters are doing some sort of question game or secret game? And when you have seen that, did you like it or dislike? Have you done it? And how do you think it worked or didn't work in the stories you read? And why do you think it worked in the story you wrote? Unless you didn't think it worked in the story you wrote, but I'm going to give you the benefit of the doubt that you think it worked in your story, because it can. I just would not recommend it, and I generally prefer other things. But anyway, that's everything I have to say. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you later.